When you wake up in the morning, you are faced with a fundamental decision: what will dictate the course of your day? Most people reach for their phones, check the news, scroll through social media, or dive headfirst into a mental list of obligations. Immediately they are immersed in chaos. The worries of the world press in before they even have a chance to take a deep breath. But there is another way, one that demands discipline but offers something far greater in return. Worship in the morning is an intentional act. It is a declaration that before anything else, before the worries, the responsibilities, the ambitions, or the distractions, there is something higher, something transcendent that must come first. It is an act of ordering your day, and in doing so, an act of ordering your life. Because if you start the day in chaos, then chaos will likely follow. But if you start the day in reverence, in stillness, in gratitude, then you have set a foundation upon which everything else can be built. There is something profound about acknowledging the sacred in the early hours. The world is quiet. The day has not yet filled with demands. Your mind, if you allow it, is more open, more receptive. In this state, worship becomes more than a ritual, it becomes a conversation. It is not simply about reciting words or following tradition. It is about aligning yourself with something beyond yourself. It is about remembering that you are not the center of existence, that your struggles, though real, are not the entirety of reality, and that there is meaning to be found beyond your immediate circumstances. This act of worship, whether through prayer, meditation, reading, or reflection, shapes the way you see everything else. It is a corrective lens. Left to its own devices, the mind tends toward disorder. It becomes consumed with self-interest, with fear, with distraction. It fixates on problems, amplifies anxieties, and seeks comfort in ways that ultimately lead to further instability. But when you begin the day in worship, you are recalibrating your perspective. You are actively choosing to start with gratitude rather than complaint, with reverence rather than entitlement, with purpose rather than aimlessness. People often underestimate the power of small habits. They assume that transformation comes in grand, sweeping gestures. But in reality, the most profound changes come from the smallest, most consistent actions. Worship in the morning is one of those actions. It may seem simple, but its effects compound over time. A single morning of worship may not radically alter your life, but a habit of morning worship, a discipline of setting aside that time every single day, can reshape your entire worldview. It is no coincidence that throughout history, some of the most disciplined, wise, and resilient people have made this a cornerstone of their lives. They understood that if you do not intentionally fill your mind with something meaningful, the world will fill it with something meaningless. The modern world is a battlefield of attention. Everywhere you look, something is demanding your focus, attempting to steer you in a certain direction. The question is, who or what will you allow to dictate your thoughts? If you do not take control of that process, something else will. There is a deeper reason why worship in the morning is so powerful. It is not just about starting the day on a positive note. It is about positioning yourself to receive wisdom, strength, and clarity. It is about acknowledging that you do not have all the answers and that your perspective is inherently limited. It is about opening yourself up to insight that transcends your own understanding. The practical effects of this are undeniable. When you start the day with worship, you become more patient, more centered, more resistant to the distractions and frustrations that would otherwise derail you. You become more conscious of your words and actions, more aware of how you treat others, more mindful of the bigger picture. You do not simply react to circumstances, you respond with intention. Contrast this with the alternative. When you neglect worship, when you dive straight into the demands of the world, you are operating on a different foundation. You are more likely to be consumed by stress, to react impulsively, to be swayed by emotions rather than principles. You are more likely to feel lost, overwhelmed, and disconnected from any deeper sense of purpose. This is not to say that worship eliminates struggle. Life is difficult. There will be challenges. There will be days when worship feels like a discipline rather than an inspiration. But that is precisely why it matters. Worship is not about escaping reality. It is about equipping yourself to face it with strength and wisdom. It is about fortifying your mind and soul so that when trials come, you are not easily shaken. There is a reason why those who prioritize worship seem to navigate life differently. They have an anchor. They are not as easily thrown off course. They do not fall apart at the first sign of difficulty because they have built something stronger within themselves. And that strength does not come from wishful thinking or blind optimism. It comes from an active, intentional choice to start each day in alignment with something greater. If you want to transform your days, begin by transforming your mornings. Take control of that time. Make worship a priority, not an afterthought. Let it shape your mindset, your attitude, and your approach to the world. And over time, you will begin to see the difference, not just in the way you feel, but in the way you live. Faith is not a static thing. It is not something you simply have like a possession that sits on a shelf gathering dust. No, it must be nurtured, exercised, and strengthened, because if it is not, it will erode, and in its place, doubt and fear will grow. And doubt, once it takes root, has a way of twisting itself around your perception, corrupting the way you see the world, convincing you that you are alone, that things are meaningless, that you are adrift. But you are not adrift. And faith, when strengthened, can serve as a foundation that allows you to endure whatever storms may come. One of the most effective ways to strengthen faith is through worship. Not worship in the shallow sense, not mere routine. Not a set of words mindlessly repeated, but real intentional worship. The kind of worship that forces you to reflect, that demands something of you. The kind of worship that reorients your thinking and reminds you of truths that are easy to forget in the chaos of daily life. The truth that there is something higher than you. That your struggles, no matter how overwhelming, do not define the whole of existence. That you are not wandering aimlessly, but rather you are part of a larger narrative, a story that extends far beyond your immediate concerns. Faith is often misunderstood. Some assume that it is a form of naive optimism, a refusal to look at the harsh realities of life. But true faith is not blind. It does not ignore suffering. It does not deny the existence of pain, failure, and loss. Instead, it acknowledges them fully but refuses to be consumed by them. True faith is the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances, to recognize that there is meaning in the struggle, that growth and transformation often come through adversity. And that kind of faith must be cultivated. It does not simply appear. It must be fed, developed, and strengthened over time. The world is relentless in its attempts to undermine faith. Every day you are bombarded with reasons to doubt, reasons to be cynical, reasons to believe that everything is random and meaningless. And if you are not actively strengthening your faith, then it will be weakened by default. There is no neutrality in this. You are either growing in faith or you are losing it. That is why worship matters. Worship is an act of defiance against despair. It is a refusal to accept the narrative that life is nothing more than struggle and suffering. It is a declaration that there is something greater, something worth believing in, something that transcends momentary hardships. But worship does more than just reinforce belief. It also transforms the way you live. When faith is weak, people become reactionary. They allow circumstances to dictate their emotions. They are thrown off course by setbacks, paralyzed by uncertainty, crushed by disappointment. They live as though they are at the mercy of the world, constantly swayed by whatever happens to them. But when faith is strong, there is stability. There is resilience. There is the ability to withstand difficulties without being consumed by them. And worship, real intentional worship, is one of the most powerful ways to cultivate that strength. It is easy to take faith for granted when things are going well, when life is comfortable, when problems seem small, when there is no immediate crisis. Faith can become secondary, an afterthought. But that is precisely when it must be strengthened. Because when hardship comes, and it will come, you will fall back on whatever foundation you have built. If you have neglected your faith, if you have let it weaken, then in those moments of crisis, you will find yourself lost, struggling to regain footing. But if you have spent time strengthening it, if you have made worship a priority, if you have engaged in reflection, if you have actively reminded yourself of the greater truths that sustain you, then you will not be so easily shaken. There is a reason why those who have strong faith seem to navigate life differently. They are not free from pain. They are not immune to hardship. But they carry themselves with a sense of purpose and conviction. They are not thrown into despair by every setback. They do not crumble under pressure. They do not lose themselves in fear. And this is not because they are naturally stronger or more capable than others. It is because they have taken the time to build a foundation that can withstand the storms of life. And make no mistake, life will test you. It will test your convictions, your patience, your endurance. It will challenge everything you claim to believe. And if your faith is weak, if it has not been nurtured, then you will find yourself struggling to hold on to anything at all. That is why this work must be done before the storm arrives. Strength is not built in the moment of crisis. It is built in the moments leading up to it. It is built in the quiet, disciplined practice of daily worship. So if you want to live with purpose, if you want to stand firm in the face of adversity, if you want to navigate life with wisdom and strength, then you must take your faith seriously. You must strengthen it, not just when it is convenient, but as a daily practice. You must recognize that faith, like anything else, requires effort. And that effort begins with worship. Because worship is not just something you do, it is something that shapes who you are. It is what anchors you in truth. It is what gives you the strength to endure, the clarity to see beyond immediate struggles, and the confidence to move forward, no matter what lies ahead. The human mind is a battlefield. Every day, whether you recognize it or not, you are engaged in a struggle between order and chaos, between discipline and neglect, between the pursuit of meaning and the descent into nihilism. This battle does not take place on some grand stage, nor is it fought with swords and shields. It is fought in the smallest decisions of your daily life. It is fought in whether you choose to rise with purpose or fall into complacency. It is fought in whether you orient yourself towards something meaningful or allow yourself to be consumed by distraction. And one of the most profound ways this battle is fought is in the realm of worship. Worship, when done properly, is an act of focus, a deliberate structuring of the mind toward the highest possible ideal. It is not simply about repetition, about saying words that have been said before. It is about aligning yourself with something greater than your immediate impulses. And this is not easy because the mind is naturally unruly. It is constantly drawn in 1,000 directions at once. It is distracted by worries, by regrets, by fleeting pleasures that offer short-term gratification at the cost of long-term fulfillment. Worship, then, is a means of bringing order to that chaos. It is a practice that demands your attention, that requires you to set aside the constant noise of your own mind and reorient yourself towards something transcendent. But many people do not understand this. They assume that worship is about mere participation, about going through the motions without engaging in the deeper struggle that it represents. And because of this misunderstanding, they do not reap its benefits. They view it as an obligation rather than opportunity, as something they must do rather than something they need to do. And in that state of mind, it becomes empty. It becomes nothing more than another task to check off a list. If worship is to be truly transformative, it must be undertaken with sincerity. It must not be a passive act, but an active one. It must be approached with the same level of engagement that one would bring to a serious intellectual pursuit. It must challenge you. It must force you to reflect, to confront your own shortcomings, to wrestle with the deeper questions of existence. And this is not comfortable. This is not easy. It is far easier to treat worship as a mere formality, to participate without engaging, to show up without being present. But that is a dangerous path because it leads to spiritual stagnation. It creates the illusion of faith without the substance of it. This is the problem with routine without meaning. Any habit, no matter how virtuous it may appear on the surface, can become empty if it is not infused with intentionality. Even the most sacred acts can become hollow if they are performed without true engagement. And this is why people often drift away from faith without realizing it. It is not that they make a conscious decision to abandon their beliefs. It is that their worship becomes mechanical, devoid of true participation, and slowly, without noticing, they become disconnected from the source of meaning that once sustained them. But this does not have to be the case. Worship, if engaged with properly, can be a powerful tool for realignment. It can serve as a daily recalibration, a way of ensuring that you are not drifting aimlessly through life, but are instead moving with purpose. It can function as a safeguard against despair, a reminder that you are part of something greater than yourself, that your struggles are not meaningless, that there is order in the midst of the apparent chaos. But to access this, you must be willing to engage fully. You must not allow yourself to fall into the trap of passive participation. You must approach worship with the same level of seriousness that you would bring to any other great endeavor in life. And this requires humility, because to engage with worship properly is to acknowledge that you do not have all the answers. It is to recognize that there is wisdom beyond your own understanding, that there are truths that you have not yet grasped, that there is still much to learn. This is a difficult thing for many people to accept. We like to believe that we are in control, that we have things figured out, that we do not need guidance. But this is arrogance, and arrogance blinds us to growth. True wisdom begins with the recognition of one's own limitations. And worship, when undertaken sincerely, cultivates this recognition. It forces you to confront the reality that there is more to existence than your own narrow perspective. This is why worship is not simply a personal act, but a communal one. It is not just about the individual experience, but about the collective pursuit of truth. When people come together in worship, they are engaging in an ancient tradition, a practice that has sustained countless generations before them. They are participating in something that transcends time, something that connects them to the great story of humanity itself. And in doing so, they are reminded that they are not alone. They are reminded that their struggles, no matter how overwhelming they may seem, are part of a larger narrative. But this understanding does not come automatically. It must be cultivated. It must be pursued. It must be protected from the forces of complacency and distraction. Because if you do not actively engage in this pursuit, then the default state of the mind chaos, doubt, fragmentation will take hold. Worship is not just an act of devotion, it is an act of discipline. It is a way of training the mind to focus on what is truly important. And that is no small thing. Because in a world filled with distractions, in a world that constantly pulls you in 1,000 different directions, the ability to focus, to truly engage, to truly participate in something meaningful is an extraordinary gift. So do not take this gift for granted. Do not allow yourself to fall into the trap of routine without engagement. Do not treat worship as a mere obligation. Instead, approach it with the seriousness it deserves. Approach it with the understanding that it is not just a task, but a training ground, not just a ritual, but a realignment of the soul. Because how you engage in worship will shape how you engage with the rest of your life. It will determine whether you are moving forward with purpose or merely drifting. And in a world as complex and uncertain as this one, that is not a choice to take lightly. Every day you wake up with a choice. You can either move toward order or slip into chaos. You can orient yourself toward meaning or allow yourself to be swallowed by the distractions, temptations, and trivialities of life. And the way you make that choice is through the habits you cultivate, especially the habits that shape the first moments of your day. Worship, when properly understood, is not simply about engaging in ritual for the sake of tradition. It is a discipline, a structure that frames your existence. It is a way of acknowledging that there is something higher than yourself, something greater than your momentary desires or fears. But here is the problem. Many people engage in worship absent-mindedly. They go through the motions without truly understanding what they are doing. And when this happens, worship loses its power. It becomes a shallow practice, a mere routine rather than a transformative experience. What does this mean? It means that if you are going to engage in something as profound as worship, you must do so with your full attention. You must bring your mind into alignment with your actions. You cannot simply say words without reflecting on their meaning. You cannot simply attend a gathering without understanding why you were there. You cannot simply listen to sacred texts without internalizing their lessons. Because if you do, then you are not actually engaging with worship. You are just pretending to. And pretense is dangerous. It creates the illusion of faith while leaving you spiritually empty. This is not just about religious practice. It is about how you orient yourself in the world. If you do not approach worship with sincerity, then what else in your life are you failing to approach sincerely? If you are not fully present in worship, then are you fully present in your relationships? Are you fully present in your work? Are you fully present in your responsibilities? The way you engage with one thing often reflects the way you engage with everything. If you allow yourself to drift through the sacred, then you will likely drift through the rest of your life as well. And drifting is dangerous. It is how people lose their way. People wonder why they feel disconnected, why they feel lost, why they feel like they are merely existing rather than truly living. Often the answer is simple. They are not engaging with the world properly. They are moving through life passively rather than actively. They are allowing themselves to be led by impulse rather than by discipline. They are neglecting the habits that bring order and meaning into their lives. And worship is one of the most important of those habits. Because what is worship fundamentally? It is an act of recognition. It is an acknowledgement that you are not the center of the universe, that there is something beyond you, something above you. It is an act of humility, a moment in which you set aside your own arrogance and admit that you do not have all the answers, and that is a difficult thing to do. It is far easier to live under the illusion of control, to believe that you are fully self-sufficient, that you do not need guidance or correction. But that is a lie, and lies, when believed long enough, lead to destruction. This is why so many people struggle. They have disconnected themselves from the source of meaning. They have placed themselves at the center of their own universe, and as a result, their world has become small, empty, and fragile. Worship, when done properly, counters this. It expands your perspective. It reminds you that you are part of something larger. It connects you to the wisdom of the past, to the traditions that have guided people for centuries, to the truths that endure beyond any one individual's fleeting opinions or emotions. But you have to engage with it properly. You have to mean what you say when you pray. You have to listen deeply when you hear sacred words. You have to reflect on their significance. Allow them to challenge you. Allow them to shape you. And that requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable, because true growth always involves discomfort. If worship is not challenging you, if it is not making you reflect, if it is not forcing you to confront your own weaknesses and failings, then you are not engaging with it fully. You are skimming the surface rather than diving deep. And what happens when people skim the surface for too long? They lose depth. They become shallow. They become easily swayed by every new trend, every passing ideology, every momentary distraction. They lack roots. They lack stability. And when a storm comes, when tragedy strikes, when hardship appears, they are unable to withstand it. They crumble. They fall into despair because they never built a foundation strong enough to hold them up. This is why true worship is not just a habit. It is a necessity. It is something that fortifies you against the difficulties of life. It is something that grounds you, that strengthens you, that reminds you of who you are and who you are meant to be. It is something that provides clarity when the world feels confusing, hope when the world feels meaningless, but only if you engage with it properly, only if you approach it with sincerity, only if you truly participate rather than merely observe. So the question is this: how are you engaging? Are you treating worship as a mere obligation, something to check off a list? Or are you treating it as an opportunity for realignment, for growth, for transformation? Because the way you engage with it will determine the role it plays in your life. It will determine whether it strengthens you or whether it remains a hollow routine. It will determine whether you are moving toward order or slipping into chaos. And that is no small thing, because your life is shaped by the habits you cultivate. Your character is forged in the choices you make every day. And the way you engage with worship will reflect in the way you engage with everything else. So do not take it lightly. Do not approach it passively. Do not allow yourself to drift. Engage fully. Be present. Seek meaning, because your life depends on it. Discipline is the foundation of all achievement, and there are few disciplines more vital than the discipline of worship, because what is worship if not an alignment of your mind, body, and soul towards something higher than yourself? It is an act of voluntary submission, not submission in the sense of weakness, but submission in the sense of acknowledging that you are not the ultimate authority in your own life, that there is wisdom greater than yours, a purpose beyond your own self-interest, and a structure to reality that must be respected if you wish to live a meaningful life. But this is where many people falter. They resist discipline. They resist structure. They resent any form of authority, even the authority of truth itself. They believe they can construct their own reality, define their own purpose, and live by their own rules without consequence. But that is a delusion, because reality does not bend to personal whims. There are immutable principles that govern existence, and those who ignore them do so at their own peril. One of those principles is this: you cannot find meaning without proper orientation. If you aim at nothing, you will hit nothing. If you do not align yourself with something higher, you will be swallowed by something lower. And worship, properly understood, is an act of aiming. It is a practice of setting your sights on something beyond the immediate, the trivial, and the self-indulgent. It is a commitment to a higher mode of being, a recognition that life is not just about what you want, but about what is right. Now, many people reject this idea outright. They say, why should I subject myself to something greater? Why should I humble myself before anything? But the answer is simple: because you are limited, because you do not know everything, because you are prone to error, to arrogance, to selfishness, and to blindness. And if you do not acknowledge this, if you do not discipline yourself through acts of humility and submission to truth, then your own desires, your own impulses, and your own unchecked emotions will become your master. And that is precisely what happens when people abandon worship. They do not simply become free. They do not simply rise above old traditions and moral structures to become enlightened beings of their own design. No, they become aimless. They drift. They substitute the discipline of worship for the chaos of self-indulgence, and they suffer for it. Because the human soul cannot bear meaninglessness. It cannot thrive without order. It cannot function properly without a hierarchy of values to guide it. Consider what happens when people reject discipline in any other domain. A man who refuses to discipline his body will become weak and unhealthy. A student who refuses to discipline his mind will become ignorant and incapable. A worker who refuses to discipline his habits will become unreliable and unsuccessful. This is self-evident. And yet when it comes to the discipline of worship, the discipline of orienting oneself toward something transcendent, many people believe they can simply discard it without consequence. But that is a mistake, because the consequences are real, and they manifest in the form of a life that feels adrift, hollow, and unanchored. Worship is not about blind obedience. It is not about ritual for the sake of ritual. It is about creating a framework within which you can properly structure your life. It is about setting aside your own arrogance, recognizing your own limitations, and aligning yourself with truths that are deeper than your own personal opinions or emotions. And that is not a trivial thing, because without that alignment, you will be left to navigate existence with nothing but your own flawed instincts to guide you. And that is a dangerous position to be in. Now, some people argue that they can live moral, disciplined lives without any form of worship, and to some extent that is true. There are individuals who, through sheer force of will, maintain a sense of order and purpose without explicitly engaging in acts of religious devotion. But here is the problem: without a structure beyond yourself to keep you accountable, without a higher authority to which you hold yourself responsible, you become the final judge of your own behavior. And when that happens, it becomes far too easy to justify your own shortcomings. It becomes far too easy to drift into self-deception, to rationalize bad decisions, and to prioritize comfort over truth. This is why worship matters. It is a safeguard against the tyranny of the self. It is a practice that forces you to look beyond your own perspective, to acknowledge something greater than your own preferences, and to hold yourself accountable to a standard that does not shift according to your convenience. It is in many ways an antidote to the chaos of the modern world, a world that increasingly tells people that they are their own gods, that they can create their own meaning out of thin air, that they can redefine reality to suit their desires. But reality does not work that way. Meaning is not something you invent. It is something you discover. It is something you align yourself with And worship, when done properly, is one of the most powerful ways to engage in that alignment. It is a practice that reminds you that you are not the center of the universe, that you have responsibilities beyond yourself, and that there is a moral structure to existence that must be respected if you wish to live a life that is meaningful rather than merely pleasurable. So the question you must ask yourself is this: are you engaging in worship with sincerity, or are you merely going through the motion? Are you using it as a means of realignment, or are you treating it as a routine devoid of meaning? Because the way you answer that question will determine whether worship is a source of strength in your life or just an empty tradition. And that distinction is no small matter, because if you do not orient yourself towards something higher, something meaningful, something fundamentally true, then you will be left with nothing but your own whims to guide you. And history and personal experience tells us that is not enough. So engage with discipline. Seek with sincerity. Do not allow yourself to drift, because the cost of aimlessness is high, and the rewards of proper alignment are profound. There is a tendency among people, particularly in modern times, to treat faith as a passive act, something that exists in the background, a cultural inheritance that requires little effort beyond basic acknowledgement. But that is not how deep belief functions. That is not how meaningful commitment to a higher order is established. Worship is not merely about attendance, nor is it about saying the right words at the right time. It is about engagement. It is about participation. It is about orienting oneself towards something fundamentally meaningful and making the deliberate choice to maintain that orientation every single day. Because what happens if you don't? What happens if worship is reduced to nothing more than a formality? You begin to drift. You begin to lose sight of the very structure that gives meaning to your life. And that is a serious problem, because the alternative to structure is chaos. Not necessarily the kind of chaos that announces itself loudly, that arrives in a sudden and catastrophic collapse, but the quiet kind, the kind that seeps into your habits, your thoughts, your relationships, until one day you wake up and realize that you have no idea who you are or what you are doing anymore. That is what happens when people engage in worship absent-mindedly. They assume that going through the motions is enough. They assume that because they were raised within a certain belief system, or because they have repeated certain words 1,000 times, they are automatically living in alignment with truth. But that is not how it works, because truth is not something you inherit. It is something you pursue. And it is something that you must pursue consciously, deliberately, and with discipline. If you do not engage fully, you run the risk of self-deception. You run the risk of believing that you are living in accordance with something meaningful, when in reality you are simply avoiding the discomfort of questioning yourself. And that is a dangerous place to be, because self-deception has consequences. If you tell yourself that you are living properly, that you are upholding the right values, that you are engaging in worship with sincerity, when in reality you are merely acting out a hollow performance, then your own conscience will begin to turn against you. You will begin to experience a kind of internal discord, a sense that something is not quite right, that you are not quite honest with yourself, that you are playing a game rather than living the truth. And that kind of internal conflict does not resolve itself on its own. If left unaddressed, it grows. It manifests in the form of anxiety, dissatisfaction, frustration, and then people wonder why they feel disconnected, why they feel as though something is missing. But the answer is often simple. They have not truly committed to anything. They have not fully engaged in the act of worship, nor have they allowed it to transform them in any real way. They have treated it as a routine rather than as a fundamental pillar of existence. And if that is how you approach worship, then it is only a matter of time before it ceases to have any real effect on your life. You will find yourself asking why you engage in it at all. You will find yourself searching for meaning elsewhere, often in places that do not offer meaning at all, but rather temporary distractions, temporary pleasures, temporary escapes from the deeper questions that you have refused to confront. This is why participation matters. It is why sincerity matters. Because if you are not serious about aligning yourself with something greater, then you will inevitably align yourself with something lesser. And that is not an abstract statement. That is a fundamental reality. If you do not aim at something meaningful, something true, then you will aim at something that is expedient, something that is comfortable, something that is easy. And while ease may seem attractive in the short term, it leads nowhere in the long term. You must ask yourself, why do you engage in worship? What does it mean to you? Is it an obligation, something you do because you are expected to? Or is it something that you actively participate in, something that you recognize as necessary, as vital, as foundational? These are not trivial questions, because the way you answer them will determine whether your spiritual life is alive or merely an empty shell of what it could be. And that distinction is critical. Because if worship is alive, it strengthens you. It gives you direction. It reinforces your commitment to something greater. It keeps you from becoming lost in the trivial distractions of the world. But if worship is hollow, if it is performed without thought, without sincerity, without real engagement, then it becomes little more than a ritual devoid of power. And in that case, it is only a matter of time before doubt creeps in, before meaning erodes, before faith begins to feel like an obligation rather than a source of strength. So the responsibility falls on you. No one else can make this decision for you. No one else can engage in worship on your behalf. You must choose to do so with sincerity. You must decide whether you are willing to approach it not as an afterthought, not as a routine, but as a fundamental act of alignment with something meaningful. Because that decision will shape not only your spiritual life, but your entire existence. And if you choose to engage, if you choose to make worship a real living part of your life, then it will transform you, it will anchor you, it will provide you with a foundation that no external circumstance can shake. And that is not a small thing. Because in a world that is constantly shifting, constantly changing, constantly pulling people away from what matters, having something solid to hold on to is a necessity. It is the difference between drifting aimlessly and moving forward with purpose. It is the difference between feeling lost and knowing exactly where you stand. So do not take this lightly. Do not allow yourself to fall into the trap of passive belief. Make the decision to participate fully, because the rewards of that decision, clarity, stability, purpose, are worth far more than the temporary comfort of going through the motion. Human beings are by their very nature creatures of habit and routine, and yet many fail to recognize the significance of the rituals they engage in on a daily basis. The small, seemingly inconsequential actions that shape each morning are in truth the foundation upon which the rest of their lives are built. And when these rituals involve something as profound as worship, they are not merely habits. They are declarations, statements about one's values, priorities, and deepest conviction. Now consider what it means to truly worship. Not in the casual, half-hearted sense that so many people default to, but in the deep, transformative way that fundamentally alters one's being. Worship is not just an act. It is an orientation towards something greater. It is the conscious alignment of oneself with an order that transcends the individual, with a structure that provides meaning in a world so often dominated by chaos and uncertainty. But that kind of worship does not happen by accident. It requires attention, discipline, and above all, sincerity. The problem is that many people treat worship as a passive act, something that happens to them rather than something they actively engage in. They show up, they go through the motions, they say the right words, but they do not necessarily mean them. And the consequences of this disengagement are not merely theoretical, they are deeply practical. When worship is hollow, when it is reduced to an obligation rather than a sincere pursuit, it ceases to have any real impact on a person's life. It becomes a ritual devoid of transformation. And that is a serious problem. Because what happens when worship loses its meaning? What happens when a person stops engaging with it fully, when they no longer feel connected to its purpose? They begin to drift, and drifting is dangerous. It does not always happen dramatically all at once in some grand moment of realization. More often than not, it happens slowly, quietly, imperceptibly, a small compromise here, a bit of cynicism there, and before they know it, they are lost. Not in the literal sense, but in the way that matters most. They no longer know who they are, what they believe, or why any of it matters. That is what happens when people allow worship to become a passive routine rather than an active pursuit. They disconnect from the source of meaning that once anchored them, and in its place they find themselves increasingly subject to the pull of lesser things, distractions, entertainment, fleeting pleasures. They trade the profound for the trivial, the meaningful for the convenient, and in doing so, they deprive themselves of the very thing that could provide them with the stability and direction they so desperately need. But this does not have to be the case. Worship can be more than a habit. It can be a force of transformation. It can be the foundation upon which a life of purpose is built. But only if it is approached with the seriousness it deserves. Only if it is treated not as an afterthought, but as a priority. Because that is the reality. Worship is not something that simply happens to a person. It is something they must choose to engage in, something they must commit themselves to fully, without reservation. And that is not always easy. It requires effort. It requires sacrifice. It requires the willingness to set aside distractions, to silence the noise of the world, and to focus on something greater. But the rewards of that effort are immense. Because when worship is engaged in with sincerity, it provides something that nothing else can, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection to something larger than oneself. And that is not a small thing. In fact, it is one of the most crucial things a person can have. Because life is difficult. That much is undeniable. There will be suffering, there will be hardship, there will be moments of doubt, of uncertainty, of despair. And in those moments, a person's foundation matters more than anything else. If they have built their life on something solid, on something meaningful, something real, then they will be able to withstand whatever comes their way. But if they have built their life on something shallow, on something fleeting, on something that holds no real substance, then they will crumble at the first sign of trouble. This is why the seriousness of worship matters. It is not about obligation. It is not about routine. It is about preparation. It is about equipping oneself with the strength necessary to navigate life's inevitable challenges. It is about establishing a connection to something unshakable, something that remains steady even when everything else is falling apart. And so, the responsibility falls on each individual. No one else can make this decision for them. No one else can ensure that their worship is sincere, that it is meaningful, that it is transformative. That is a choice they must make for themselves every single day. They must decide whether they will engage fully or merely go through the motions, whether they will allow worship to shape them or whether they will let it fade into the background. But if they choose to engage, if they choose to take it seriously, to commit themselves fully, then they will find something extraordinary. They will find that worship is not just an act, but a way of being. Not just a moment of prayer, but a lifelong pursuit of truth and meaning. And in that pursuit, they will discover what so many have forgotten. That true fulfillment does not come from comfort, from distraction, from fleeting pleasure. It comes from alignment with something greater. It comes from devotion to something meaningful. It comes from the sincere and deliberate act of worship. And that is no small thing. Because in a world where so many are lost, where so many are adrift, where so many are searching for something they cannot quite name, those who commit themselves fully to this pursuit will find what they are looking for. They will find strength, they will find direction, they will find purpose, but only if they choose to engage. Only if they decide, truly decide, that worship is not just something they do, but something they live.